Welcome to our 50th season of Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our live broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook Live. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Joining me tonight are Sam Texeira, a teacher at Henderson High School in Dorchester. History teacher Kevin Dua at Cambridge Rindge and Latin School. He was also the 2017 Massachusetts History Teacher of the Year. Nivia Piña, a special education teacher at the Margarita Muñiz Academy, the first bilingual high school located in Jamaica Plain. And Marcus Walker, a teacher at Excel High School in South Boston. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So we're having this conversation where teachers are literally in the streets in several states. Certainly in Arizona and Oklahoma is the one probably the situation where people are going to think of most recently 9 days. They didn't quite get everything that they wanted, but the issues that they raised were about equity in terms of their salaries and also expanded school funding, which are ongoing problems everywhere. But also, the overarching statement that they made by their going out was, nobody is respecting the job that we do. Nobody is understanding and respecting the job that we do. So I want to just start there with all of you and just get your sense about what you feel about how teachers in this day and time are viewed. Let's start with you, Sam.
I think that on the whole, we're viewed pretty positively if you ask the average person. I think that most teachers probably have pretty phenomenal relationships with their students and with their students' families. But I think that ultimately there's sort of political interests that make teachers, particularly public school teachers, sort of villainized in the sense that we are collecting too much money, our pensions are through the roof, that the problems that can really be attributed to poverty and discrimination and sort of institutional issues that are decades in the past, that somehow we're to blame for it. And so I think that there's a very politically charged movement in that direction, but I think that on the whole, most people that I know sort of view teachers positively.
Kevin.
I would say depending on the region of an educator, it can highlight the responsibilities, it can highlight the strains, it can highlight, as you were saying, like the political insight that folks feel that educators should have in the classroom. And for individuals in that space, it presents them with an opportunity to go along with the flow or even to combat that. And what you see in many pockets in certain areas in the country are that there are teachers who feel that the community that they're in is not supporting them due to some type of bias. And so when you have that, it presents a unique opportunity for community leaders, for students, for parents, for politicians, to try to say exactly how they value an educator, whether it's monetary, based off their instruction, based off standardized assessments, because without that clarification, you have this tension, you have this sense that folks aren't on the same page, and it distracts in many ways, unfortunately, the support towards the youth in the area.
All right, Nivia.
I mean, I just have to echo what you guys have saying. But in my experience, how we value teachers in the past and how we value teachers now, it's completely different. I think.
In what way?
I remember that my teacher was like my mother, and I respected her or them, but now we are more like, we're even afraid sometimes of saying something to our kids or raising our, like trying to discipline or something because something might happen. And so in that respect, I think that things have changed greatly.
So I really appreciate the reflection back to the larger community of working people in America. So I'm glad that teachers are getting some attention lately. I'm glad that those teachers are out there walking, fighting for equal funding for their school and fighting for better pay. It's absolutely heartbreaking to hear about a teacher that's taking a second and third job. that doesn't make sense to me. There's a fellow social studies teacher in Tulsa, and I think his quote was, we're not walking for ourselves anymore. We're walking for everybody. And I was really really feeling what he was saying. I mean, I feel like this is possibly not just teachers, but other working people in America who are constantly fighting against inequality and inequity. I mean, bottom line, I mean, it's a much bigger and longer conversation, but bottom line, the amount of inequality and inequity in this country is a serious problem, and hopefully people are starting to try to make a change.
May I add something to that?
Well, what I was going to say is, if I can just pivot a bit, is that, so that's the context in general. So now, for you, teachers of color, we're talking about something entirely different in many ways. And that should be made clear. There was just a report last month called Broken Promises, Teacher Diversity in Boston Public Schools. And the numbers are appalling. I would say you four probably represent a big hunk of how many teachers of color there are in the district. I mean, this is how small the numbers are. And we should say that in conjunction with the demographic student population, which is overwhelmingly Black and now overwhelmingly Latino. So I want to get the take now from that perspective, because you're operating a different space. And I also want to point out that each of you said in one way or the other this one same thing, which is that it was a lot emotionally for each of to be a teacher of color now, because you're carrying another weight, not just for yourself, but what the students, the students who see you and are so happy to see you. So I want to talk about that, because that's something that I don't think people understand.
Well, in response to that, and also to kind of extend what Marcus said, I think that one of the sort of perspectives that we also have to keep in mind is that this is not just about sort of teacher pay. This is also that our sort of working conditions are learning conditions. And so one of the things that I had read very recently on social media, a really interesting article that talked about the fact that since the Great Recession a decade ago, upwards of 400,000 student support staff in schools are now gone, and that teachers are sort of having to fill that void. And so whether you're a newer teacher who's always sort of lived that,
Which you are.
right, 4 years, yep.
Yes, yes.
Or whether you've been teaching for a while and you've always sort of seen that, but have sort of seen the reforms, the point is that we as teachers are taking on more. And I think that as teachers of color, we sort of have a double consciousness, which is that we have to teach our content, regardless, in the sort of most basic way. But then for many of us, for whom our students' lives and experiences mirror our own, we also sort of see and have within ourselves something that says we have to do a little bit more than just teach. We have to sort of be sometimes parents, sometimes nurses, sometimes social workers, sometimes referees after school. I mean, I think that all of us sort of had this experience that when we look at young people that mirror ourselves, this is not just sort of a job, but for most of us, this is a moral calling. And I think that as teachers of color, particularly teaching in this district, we particularly feel that.
So let me pick up that about mirroring yourself, because Nivia, it was so poignant to read that you said at the end of some days you're just so drained.
Exactly.
Because of you feel all those expectations on you.
Exactly. You go to school, you have a class that you're going to teach, but then they come to school, they didn't have anything to eat to start. And then they come, Mom was not home, my clothes is dirty. So there's so many little things that go into the day that you just feel so bad. You have kids and you just like, I just can't. So you try to teach your class, and it's sometimes really hard. It's really hard. Emotionally, it's really hard.
And you're at the school that teaches bilingual education. I just want to emphasize this, because in this report, one of the things that some of the students complained about is that some of the Latino kids, people made fun of their speaking Spanish. That, they could speak English and Spanish, but people didn't want them to speak Spanish, and that it was, looked down upon.
Yes.
That's an emotional stress.
Oh, definitely. But I have a different ecosystem. My school, we encourage our kids to speak Spanish. And so our school body, it's a little bit different. It's more Hispanic. So the kids look more, their teachers look more like them. So it's a little bit different, but it's unique, I will say, compared to the rest of Boston Public Schools.
You got 3 counselors over at Excel High School.
We do.
And that's a lot. But there's a lot going on in terms of the trauma there, and then the expectation looking to you too.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely. I mean, kind of going back to what you were saying about this extra responsibility. I mean, I do believe that's true, and I do believe that for for some teachers of color, it is a burden for sure. I grew up in the Bronx, and I was a New York City public school kid. So when I actually decided to become a teacher, I very much intentionally wanted to give back, you know, all that was given to me, and very intentionally, to be totally honest, wanted to nurture black and brown children. I treat all of my students equally, but it wasn't a surprise to me. And I mean, I knew that Boston Public Schools was about 85 to 88% students of color. Very similar to New York City public schools. So that was a population I wanted to work with for sure.
Kevin, a lot of people I think don't, they listen and they say, well, what difference does it make, your presence in the school? You know, Marcus just said, we're going to teach the same content, but what does your presence mean in terms of a difference to these students?
I would say, like the idea that representation matters is not value, is not seen as a critical component to the students that we connect to across the board. I would say that's a starting point in regards to the differences in how some teachers may not understand the importance of having a colleague mirror the demographic in the classroom. I'm sure all of us can share a story where a student of color expressed some moment within their life that centered around race, something very traumatic. I've had various students that I've worked with where just the process of applying to college, for instance, was challenging, but then also putting their traumatic experiences through a personal essay to get scholarships added to that. And that's something that they don't share out to other educators who do not look like them. And so when we share our experiences, when you read such studies as this, it isn't anything new. It's almost as if it's a broken record. This sense that you have populations within our country where they are not exposed to such racial diversity, that it doesn't reflect the demographic of our country that continues to grow and grow. And when you have policies, where you have recruitment fairs that aren't reflecting that, again, it widens that gap. And so
The district would say in 2017, they had one of their most successful hiring sprees, so to speak. I don't know if a spree is the right word for teachers of color. So they're citing a figure around 44% increase. We also have to note at the same time, however, that a lot of the teachers of color who were brought in under the 1974 decree are now retiring.
Yes.
So it's hard to tell where you end up, except small numbers continuing.
But I would also say, as great as such numbers are to highlight, I think an honest conversation is putting in a historical context exactly why is there an issue, like why are educators of color not being recruited as highly? Why are young black and brown students aren't aspiring to be educators? Like there are various elements in terms of institutional and systemic oppressions and inequities in our country where such conversations on the table aren't presented to families, students, educators, lawmakers. And I think being on that same page, as you were mentioning earlier, being on that same page first, it helps us try to attack the situation, try to improve, as opposed to hoping that we have a good year in terms of percentage of hiring.
Well, the report criticizes some of the stated innovative techniques in trying to hire folks because the results have not been where they want them to be at this point. And in Boston, Marcus, in Boston, this is a big deal. It maybe becomes a bigger deal because of Boston's particularly racial climate.
Yeah, no doubt. Gosh, I'm not sure what it meant. Well, first of all, at Excel High School where I work, I think I'm fortunate. There's actually a pretty large percentage of teachers of color on our staff presently, but I think we're more the exception than the rule. You know, as far as race, and you bring up Boston, and I teach at what was the infamous South Boston High School. You know, kind of the elephant in the room is the relationship between the community, the immediate South Boston community, and the actual school itself. That's a relationship that definitely needs some serious repair, for sure. My students are aware, you know, of the tension that's there. Sometimes it's very painful for them, even though they may not want to admit it.
Are you suggesting remaining tension?
Yeah, no, there's still remaining tension. There's absolutely still remaining tension, and you know, unfortunately, in the political climate that we're in, I feel like a lot of people feel emboldened to express themselves in certain ways against my students and the population that's there, for sure.
What would you say is your, because we have you youngest, and you are the longest serving teacher here.
I'm glad you said longest and not
I
oldest.
did not say oldest, I said youngest, okay.
My students all think I'm older than I am.
Yeah. Is the toughest thing as to be a teacher of color in the district. And here's one statistic I maybe should put out so people understand, well, why can't you bring more folk in? In the graduating class of teachers programs in Massachusetts, 86% of those graduates are white and 14% are teachers of color. Right. So people understand where the gap is happening, you know, at the beginning of the pipeline, such as it is. But I'm interested in, particularly now as we're having other conversations, and we'll continue to have this, about school safety.
Yeah.
That adds another twist to this too, because the discussion took on more than, do I want to have a gun and protect my students or not? But for teachers of color, it was like, me having a gun is, in this climate and in this history, is not in the best place to be for many, many reasons, to be mistaken for the shooter, if you will. Yeah. And I just, was that the kind of conversation you all were having when the gun, no gun conversation was happening?
Well, I've certainly had it with my students. So in addition to my work as a teacher, I also facilitate a young men's organization, Strong Men, Strong Leaders, in my school. We have several goals, and one of which is to just sort of have open and honest conversations about successes and challenges that are going on in our lives and communities. And I think that my students, because they live it, don't need the sort of academic language and academic vocab to know that people have implicit biases against young men of color, and that they would be in a particularly dangerous situation. And even we as educators, particularly as men of color, would also be in a dangerous situation. Our sort of ability to build bridges with our students rests on relationship building. And I think that by empowering, in a very negative and violent way, a teacher to have a gun, that sort of puts everybody at risk. I think that schools are already sort of hostile environments enough without that sort of added terror that could sort of ensue.
Do any of you feel differently?
I don't see myself with a gun in a classroom. Definitely, that's something that I don't want to put myself or my students in. That's a situation that it's not even her. I cannot even talk about it.
Well, just so people understand, in Boston this year, in the district this year, 7 lockdowns.
Yeah.
One at somebody's school here. Henderson, you're at Henderson, right?
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
a
Now, they
perhaps
did
briefly,
not
although
find
the
a
summer school I
gun, but it was a
yeah.
lockdown.
Yes.
So that's when they closed the school down, because they believed that some
Yes.
safety issue could happen. And, you know, that's, in 2018 to have 7 is
Right.
pretty interesting, and let you know where you are. I'd also like to note that just 2 days ago, Stan Simpson, a teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which is where those 17 people were killed, which has led to these young people in this movement, was one of the ones who came out front and said, I'm a teacher and I can protect my students and I know how to handle a gun. And he left his loaded Glock 9mm in the men's room, which was then somehow managed to get into the hand of a homeless person, and they blew a hole in the wall. So just as just saying, it's harder than it looks, I think, that for a lot of people to think about it. But anyway, So with regard to school safety, what do you think some of the issues are that need to be addressed? If you understand what the sentiment is for both your students and for teachers of color, what's the best way to handle this? Because this is not going away.
I think that our
Yeah.
mentality is sort of focused on immediate safety. Let's prevent a mass shooting. But I think that by thinking that way and by framing it in those contexts, we're not thinking about how unsafe poverty makes our students, how unsafe trauma makes our students. And I think that by not addressing that, we're sort of going to continue in this sort of rut. Because our schools can't be safe if our neighborhoods aren't safe. And our students are a reflection of what goes on in their own communities. And so I think that ultimately schools are going to sort of have to move toward community centers, which many are sort of doing, in providing resources, but that should not sort of empower policymakers to think that that's the end all be all. And ultimately, I think our country is going to have to start really thinking about how we can build a society in which there isn't sort of mass poverty and so on, and trauma, and where students sort of have the ability to work through trauma, and to that regardless of what's going on in the community, we need you to be here to learn, and that when students are ready to learn and they're ready to be engaged, then they are safer. And I think that by saying that, we're sort of looking more intentionally at the issue rather than, well, there may or may not be a shooting. Because the reality is, most schools are not getting shot. 99% are not.
Well,
But most schools have mass poverty in Boston public schools, for example, and urban schools across the country. And that's the sort of violence that happens in our communities every day that we don't even think about.
Metal detectors, do all of
we
you
have-
have? You
yes,
have them,
we have metal
right?
detectors at the
You
school.
don't have. How do you feel about that?
Well, the one we had before never worked, so like it's there, but what if it beeps? Nobody's there to check the backpacks or anything like that. So we need more people also. I'm not talking about policemen, but more of an engagement team that can talk to the kids
Right.
and redirect them. So that I think we need more. So I'm very happy about what I heard about bringing more counselors and more staff like that to school, because I think that will be also very helpful.
How's it working for you?
The metal detector issue is a serious. First of all, I don't think they're effective. I think all of this kind of goes back, reflecting back to what Sam was saying. The bottom line, I guess, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, is this inequality, you know, in education. You know, we pretend in this country that we're a meritocracy when we're not. I think we absolutely, when you look at urban districts across the country, not just Boston, it feels like it's a place to kind of warehouse high needs, low income, lots and lots of trauma kids, and just kind of concentrate them in these districts. We are largely ignored. I'm definitely very aware of the disparity between the kind of love affair the country is having with the Parkland survivors, and nothing but respect to those surviving students. But at the same time, young people, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, have been trying to make their voices heard on the issue of gun violence, and definitely not met with the same level of respect and attention. So until we kind of get really honest and brutal about the way we treat our children in this country, which is really keeping them separate, I'm really not sure. You know, this whole conversation about metal detectors and school safety, yes, it's important, but again, you know, I have to go back to what Sam, I really love what you said, if neighborhoods aren't safe, schools aren't safe, you know?
But then so if and many of you have mentioned it, if you're talking about the will of the community and the will of lawmakers, as we've seen in other communities that don't look like this one, and that teachers who don't look like you, I mean, Oklahoma, they're out for 9 days, and they still didn't, in the end, get, you know, what needed to happen that they felt to bring equity to their communities. So we're in a situation where if you have if the demographics of the student population are as they are, is there a suggestion then that there's going to be a less caring for in general? Do you see that?
I see more of, because I've had this conversation multiple times with the students over at Rindge. I'm the advisor of the Black Student Union, and they've witnessed many of their peers organize walkouts, have discussions, but the conversation we're having in the classroom, you see a sense where they feel as if their insights, it's something rare. And so, I guess to put it in the context, you're right, in terms of mass shootings, like 99% of schools aren't dealing with that. In terms of mass shootings that have taken place since I was in middle school, since Columbine, if you factor that plus different areas in the country in terms of handgun violence, a key demographic that's not talked upon, if you want to talk about school safety, we're talking about community centers, is the sense of toxic masculinity. And I mentioned that simply because I think conversations about how we are interacting with young boys in terms of what we are stealing in them.
I'm going to have to leave that right there
Go
because
ahead.
I want to continue that in our Facebook Live because you've just touched on something that I think is important. That's the end of our broadcast. I want to thank you for watching all of our guests and joining us. Stay with us right now because you want to hear the end of what Kevin Dewar has to say as we continue our conversation on Facebook Live. Thank you.